hello, and welcome to Stuff TV. I'm your host, Nick Huzar. I'm also the co-founder of OfferUp, and I've spent over a decade, I think, watching secondhand goods exchange hands, and started to think a lot about my own existence and how I impact the planet, and found that really hard to find answers. So decided to start this channel and interview really interesting thought leaders to help enlighten us. And today, I'm excited to have Jonah Goldman with us today. He's with a company called North Cascade Strategies. And today, I think it would be really interesting to talk specifically navigating the bigger picture policies and working with governments. And when you're looking at a lot of things that we are trying to do as a society, that's a really important part of it. And so, Jonah, really intrigued to have you here, and would love to maybe starting off just talk about your background a bit and maybe kind of give everyone an idea and kind of how you came to be here.
Sure, Nick. Thanks so much for having me. It's exciting to have this conversation. I kind of fell into the climate thing in a very strange and not deliberate way, but I'm incredibly grateful and lucky because of what happened, which was I was working for a couple of years at the Gates Foundation, had the great opportunity to work very closely with Bill Gates on a number of different initiatives. And he asked me to come and join his personal office, largely advising on policy and communications issues. And for about a decade before that, he'd been investing in clean energy technologies and what had come to be known as Clean Tech 1.0, which was largely looked at as a pretty abysmal failure from a venture capital perspective. But he didn't really see it that way. He saw it as an opportunity to fail and then to figure out what was wrong and then to figure out new structures for moving things forward. And so when I was coming over, he asked me also to think about what a strategy could look like to really highlight the experience and the expertise that he had, which then led to the creation of something called Breakthrough Energy, which started off as a couple of venture funds, but then expanded pretty significantly to a global policy and advocacy effort that is different than a traditional climate advocacy effort in the sense that it's not focused on the overall climate objective. It's focused very specifically on how you commercialize critical technologies. So the agenda looked different than a traditional climate group. We worked very closely with many of those groups to build a kind of a macro conversation. But at the end of the day, we wanted to know how were we going to be supporting policies that were going to allow green steel or green cement or direct air capture or all of these critical technologies to develop into cost competitive product offerings. And then in addition to that, we stood up something that we called Breakthrough Energy Fellows, which is a really like cutting edge, early stage tech program, taking people kind of out of an academic environment, allowing them to start companies. And then also on the later end, which is a program called Breakthrough Energy Catalyst, which is a project development and project finance mechanism to be able to provide mostly concessional capital for kind of first of a kind commercial technology deployments at large scale. So it was a really fascinating ride for the about 8 years that I was super lucky to work with Bill and a couple others to build that effort. And since then, mostly I've been continuing to focus on this critical question of how you commercialize climate technologies, because we have in the climate game, you've got something that's a really hard nut to crack, which is we need to replace the entirety of our physical economy, like everything in your room, everything in my room, everything contributed to climate change. So we need to figure out how to do all of those things different. And quite often we have to do it in a really counterintuitive way where we're replacing things that are very cheap and very good at doing what they're doing, some often with things that are more expensive and less good at doing what they're doing. And that's a
hard
really
pill to swallow.
Yeah, it is. And so the critical element in that is quite often policy.
And stepping back at something you said earlier, I think one of the biggest, think of these macro challenges. There's so many of them, but I know one that I think I'd read and I'd watched kind of the Bill Gates documentary around nuclear, which was really interesting, and be curious to what degree you were involved in that project. But I mean, that's going to be one of their biggest constraints, I think, over the next number of decades, right? Especially when you look at EVs and everything's happening there. And we just don't have a great grid for that. And so when you're working with somebody like Bill that has a lot of capital to put to work, and he can think, I think, on longer time horizons that most investors would say, it's too long. Was that a big part of it?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, listen, you're talking about somebody who has tremendous amounts of resources, but also has the intellectual capital, unlike almost anybody else, to understand and really deploy things in really creative ways. The nuclear thing is a good example of where we have a mismatch between the ambition that we need to have as a globe and the conversation that often shapes the decisions that we make. So what the company that Bill invested in is a company called TerraPower. It's this like phenomenal technology company that is doing really cutting edge stuff and basically figuring out how to remove all of the traditional barriers that nuclear energy provides by making it 100% safe and making it more economic, having there be relatively no proliferation risk, very little waste, like really solving these problems. And the reason why it's so important is because, unlike renewables, nuclear is not an intermittent source of electrons. And so we have a technology that's been proven. Like, we know nuclear fission can produce lots and lots of electrons. And we potentially are innovating for the first time in 60 or 70 years with an application like TerraPower. But then it's really hard. There's regulatory risks, there's customer risks, there's the experience that developers have had in building nuclear that have been not fun experiences. There's cost overruns, there's timeline overruns, there's all those sorts of things. And so the question is, are you letting all of those things then say, okay, forget it, we shouldn't do nuclear?
The juice ain't worth the squeeze.
Yeah. Or are you saying, no, those are opportunities for innovation? I mean, that's where you get a leader like Bill to say, those don't seem like unsolvable problems. They seem like problems we should solve. And so, but the thing about climate is that there's very few or statements in climate. It's not like we should do nuclear, so then we shouldn't do renewables. No, we need to do
all on the table. Yeah.
We need to put it all out there. We need to allow all of them to compete, but then all of them are going to succeed because we need that many more electrons than we have right now. And that's only in the US. Like, we're not even talking about, we have access to primary energy that's consistent and reliable and cheap. There's, almost 1 billion people who don't have that luxury, and they need that for not only human survival, but economic development and all of the other pieces of the puzzle that we hope to move the planet forward in a productive way. And so we're going to really have to have a different conversation about what we deploy, where we deploy it, how we incentivize it. We need to, it is almost impossible to build new power lines. Well, the truth is that, like, you can't generate more electricity and then just have it stay in the place where it's being generated. You need to move those electrons to the people who need it.
Yeah.
And so we're going to need to have different conversations about boring topics like permitting reform and transmission. But and it's really super daunting. Like, it is one of those things where, like, if you decide that you want to go into it with a negative mindset, you can easily go down.
You're gonna get. It's like the never-ending story where the nothing's going to consume you.
Nothing will consume you. Exactly. But you can also look at it I look at it in an optimistic way in two elements. And I think that I learned this mostly because I had, again, that great opportunity to spend some time with Bill, who is truly at his core an optimist. And one of the ways is that, humanity has done a pretty good job of solving huge problems in the past. Yeah. There's none that have been bigger than this problem, but we solved a lot of really big problems. And the second piece is that if you break it down into its pieces, we've actually solved already a lot of these problems. We just need to now deploy those solutions at scale, and that's very hard.
Like, very hard. Yeah, very hard.
But we know we can do it, and so that's like a thing that makes me feel a little bit better going to sleep at
Yeah. One thing you said to me and remind me of this stat. We were talking about the fear back to nuclear for a minute and the amount of death versus other.
Yeah,
You told me some
zero.
stat that really blew my mind, and I think it hit the point on the head.
Yeah, I mean, from a death perspective, the electricity generation that the source of electricity generation that has killed the fewest people is nuclear.
Yeah.
Obviously, coal and oil have had very public, terrible disasters that have cost human life. They've also had coal in particular, but also oil and any kind of that kind of combustion has led to tons of deaths when it comes to air quality and pollution and things like that. Wind and solar are way, 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 way down the trajectory when it comes to human lives lost, and those are mostly accidents. But there have been some. But with nuclear, there actually haven't really been any. And but it doesn't mean that Chernobyl wasn't a deep, horrible disaster. I mean, that was a deep and horrible disaster. It doesn't mean that what happened with in Japan wasn't a deep and horrible disaster. It was. Those were often actually disasters at nuclear reactors, but not necessarily disasters of nuclear reactors. So that's to say, in Japan, the problem was there were a bunch of generators that failed because those generators were placed under sea level. And when you have a tsunami, you don't want to place a bunch of diesel generators under.
That doesn't make sense.
Level.
Yes.
Yeah, those generators that were going to continue to power the plant and allow it to cool itself, they were gone because the engineering was bad. In the Chernobyl situation, that thing should never have been that never should have been allowed to be built or operated the way that it was.
Mm-hmm.
And even at that time, we knew how to build things much smarter and much safer, which is why that didn't happen in the U.S. with our reactor fleet. But there was a bad regulator in the Soviet Union. There are all of these other elements to it. It wasn't the core technology. And so the core technology is something that is misunderstood. And it's misunderstood because of, part of it's misunderstood because of something that I grew up loving deeply, which is like The Simpsons, like that. People's cultural connection to the Springfield nuclear plant. And
so you got to walk around like a third eye. I think everyone's getting all contaminated by radio waves.
Everybody assumes, he works at a nuclear power plant, and there's that green core that goes into it's like the beginning of the whole show is premised on how terrible nuclear power is. But it's really not. And again, I think that at this point, like what our job is to, especially in forums like this, where, people are listening to a conversation and trying to understand better, they're tuning in because they want to understand better what we're talking about is, we have to overcome some of the lore for some of these things.
Yeah.
And move forward in a way that does solve some of the problems, which it does, which we do need to do. Like, there are serious economic risks to the current fleet of nuclear reactors. We shouldn't be deploying. That's not where we should focus our scale in nuclear. It should be in this like set of very, very creative technologies that are coming down the pike. And then we should think about like, what are we able to use it for? Are we able to use it for, one of the really cool things about that particular technology is it's both a generator and it's a storage device for technology. So it's actually a really productive complement to renewable power. And that is a technical innovation. That is smart people trying to figure out solutions using tools that we already have. It is a really inspiring kind of a journey around something that people have tended to hate. So I think that, but it's not just nuclear that has that issue in the climate space.
Sure. All of it, wind. There's always some counter argument to it. But I think to your point, if you think of what I always describe, what got us here, and I always blame it on my parents. And, because if you look at the last 75 years, it was a combination of a layering effect post World War II that I think that drove a lot of this change, right? We all moved from cities to suburbs, we got bigger houses. And then we filled our houses with more stuff. And then we got credit came out in the 50s. And then we could buy things faster. And then plastics really boomed in the 60s. Now we could store things longer. And then globalization happened. And then e-commerce happened. So the layering effect and the result of all that is what's driving, I think, a lot of this rapid change in our climate. And that took many years systemically for that to occur. And I think it's back to your point. It's not, now we got to go the other direction. But we got to try to do it in a way that's at least cost neutral, or else I think you get so many headwinds in front of you.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to recoil anytime somebody's looking for a culprit in the climate, in the climate space. I mean, it wasn't our parents, it wasn't us. I mean, my kids' generation wants to blame us.
It's just easier.
We want to blame our parents. Yeah, I mean, all of those factors that you just said are also many of which contributed to the most rapid decrease in poverty in the history of humanity. The most rapid increase in economic development around the world. The ability for us to do all kinds of crazy things like talk to each other in real time, completely comfortably through this weird interface that we're doing right now. Like the truth is that the march towards climate disaster started about 100 years before we had any idea
that it was happening
towards climate disaster. And so we created a bunch of systems that were very responsible for the time. We didn't always create them in a responsible way. So we definitely created them in a way where if you were poor, you were not going to be able to take advantage of the upside as quickly as if you were rich. If you were black, you were not able to take advantage of the upside as if you were white. So it definitely was not a perfect system. But we created a bunch of things that moved humanity in a direction that we wanted to. Longer lifespans, less poverty, like all of these different, more equality, more justice, like all of these things sort of were able to be enabled by these magic things, which were all hydrocarbons. And, it's a story of our access to energy, is the story of our human development. And so for most of that story, we had no idea that it was leading us to disaster. And so and understandably, you have younger generations saying to us, but in the 70s, maybe the 80s and 90s, you started to really know that this was a problem. And it's like, yeah, it's true. But that was 100 years after we started the ball rolling down the hill. And it's very hard to stop that ball. Now, unfortunately, we really have to stop the ball. Like, we have to do it. But the good news is that we've had all of these. First of all, part of the great news is that you do have a younger generation who is deeply committed to this issue and is designing their future in relation to it. And designing their future in relation to it is going to force a whole bunch of new decisions that I think our generation didn't have available to us, because you have a commitment to the issue and a recognition of the impact that it has on them and their kids and the health of the planet. So that I think is one of the most optimistic things I've done, to be honest with you, is that like this is going to require like dramatic cultural shifts, and that dramatic cultural shift is only going to come from a generation that has committed itself to this. And I think that we're seeing that generation move forward now. But yeah, so I think that like I don't like to look for blame. I have a background in politics and communication, so like I understand the value in both of those different domains of looking for someone to blame. But in this one, it's just not right. It's like people are like the people to blame are oil and gas companies. It's like, well, I don't know.
You benefited from that. Yeah. Well, I think to your point, I tell people all the time, because people go, "Oh, it's not my problem," or "Hey, no, it's this. China's a bigger polluter than the U.S." And I respond and say, "It's everyone's problem." Look around your house. Where do you think all your goods come from that you bought, that you wrote a check for, and you bought that? So, we're all on one big planet here, and so I think that you need to think about it at a macro level, and what role can you play and what can you do. And I think to drive real change, I think the best example I see of this today is like what's happening with like electric vehicles. I think you need policy, you need business, you need consumers. And if you get all three of those miraculously rolling, then change starts to happen. And we're watching this, I think, with the EV kind of adoption of what's happening there, which is interesting. But to your point, I've also talked to a lot of really interesting companies that in a petri dish, it's amazing. Like, the world needs this. Like there's a bunch of companies I really excited about plastics because there's a,
Mhm.
and I feel like there's a lot of innovation happening in there. But then the hard part is, okay, now how do you take this out of that single point and now get it into either the waste stream, because our waste, we got to manage our waste is a big problem, or the
Yeah,
supply chain, and that's where things tend to kind of fall down.
yeah,
I don't know if you have views on or examples of how you've seen success there, but it is a big one.
yeah, yeah. Well, it is a huge one. I mean, the number of innovations that work in a lab that have a real hard time penetrating a market because they end up being either too expensive or they don't have the trust of their customers. Or, I mean, I think that there is a lot. So, I think if you go back to the first kind of the first problems, or not really the first problems, but if you go back to like the first order problem, it's that we have to reinvent the entirety of the physical economy. And for 100 something years, we've built a physical economy based on a theory of investment finance and development that was right for that set of technologies. And the risk that investors have had to take to create a new way to build polymers that are more efficient than the way that was before, or a new way to make sure that there is high efficiency in liquid fuels than there was before, those things are all upside. There's no real technical risk. You prove it in a lab and you have the infrastructure to be able to go out and make those innovations, sort of marginal over what they were deploying before. You still use the same gas pumps. You still use the same infrastructure. You still refine primarily the same way. So, like the finance and capital structures to be able to build out those things make a whole lot of sense. They still do today. They make a ton of sense. They're not necessarily what we need for the new set of technologies that we need to bring out. So that's to say that, we're not the people who are creating a new way to do cement, to make cement, which after water is the most ubiquitous substance on the planet. There's they don't like they're not necessarily going to make those in the same plants that you made the last set of cement. And it's not just a little tweak, it's a big tweak.
Yeah.
And so you can't finance that through the same structures as you financed these other things, the last kind of cement plant. Or at least it's going to be, there has to be some other consideration and people willing to take risk at different parts of
Hmm.
the kind of financial journey. The good news is that there are some really innovative people doing really innovative things to try to solve that capital problem, because it's a capital problem. There's some technology problems, and there is great thinkers who are trying to figure that out. And I had this great opportunity to work with this group at Breakthrough that was finding these incredible entrepreneurs and these incredible technologists. But that's not enough. Like
Yeah.
ultimately the big capital doesn't come in a venture. It's not venture capital. It's project finance and it's scale capital. And it's like, how are you able to get these things around the world in an efficient way and build global markets for them? And that is a lot of capital. Like that's the trillions.
Yeah, with the
um,
T.
with the T.
Sometimes people get excited, by the way, on climate with the B, and I said it's too small. And a
Yeah.
billion is just a big number, but I'm like, no, to drive climate change, it needs to be a T. And I also think what you
Yeah.
said is interesting. I just shot an episode 2 weeks ago on cement, and I didn't
Uh-huh.
know what you had said until I dug into this, that it's the second most used kind of substance on the planet next to water. And the other one, it's the same mix we've been using since the 70s. Like it hasn't really evolved.
Yeah,
And,
Portland cement,
yeah,
and it didn't
yeah,
need to. I mean, this is another
it's
great
been fine. Yeah,
example.
yeah,
Yeah, it's been great. Like our buildings don't fall down.
yeah.
There's no other. It's very cheap, and our buildings don't fall down, and our highways don't fall down. And so, I mean, they do,
Well,
but like
sometimes.
and when they do,
In Seattle, they delayed the light rail. You saw that one. We had this light rail project in Seattle that just got delayed another 2 years because I think some of the cement was having issues.
yeah, but that is not a
Generally,
chemical problem.
yeah, that's right. That's a poor management problem. Yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, so like it's worked great. And so now we have to figure out, and so that recipe, I mean, so like if you think about this again from the regulatory and policy side, if you're a regulator or a policy driver and you have a recipe for a thing, that has proven successful millions and millions of times because every building has been made with that thing. And somebody then says, no, you need to change the recipe for that thing to something else. And you say, well, are you sure that it's safe? And everybody's like, well, of course it's safe. Like, I mean, it's fundamentally the same stuff. And so then the regulator will say, okay, so show me the million buildings where it hasn't failed. And you're like, well, I can't do that because like this is a new thing. If you're a regulator, your job is not actually to prevent in this particular in a building area. Your job is not to prevent climate change. Your job is to make sure people don't die in buildings that fall down.
That's
And
right.
so like there has to be some way to be able to do some of this stuff where you're able to prove it out and you're able to finance that proof. So all of that whole thing is before you can find the scaled market.
Yeah.
And that is a really hard thing to do. So people are going to need to take to take new risks. Now, we're in a different place than we were even 2 years ago because of a set of policies that were passed by the US government over the last couple of years. One is the infrastructure bill, and the other one is called the Inflation Reduction Act. And those two things give a lot of priority and a lot of market stabilization for these technologies that are designed to affect climate change. And in fact, in my mind, they are creating the global macro environment for what we're going to need for the next 15 years, which has been a real problem in climate for a while, which is that we don't know what kind of policy environment we're working within. So even though they're US focused policies, they're the model for how a lot of other countries are thinking about these things. So Canada's thinking about it, the European Union's thinking about it this way, Japan. Like they're all thinking about their policies in reference to the IRA and to the IIJA. And that's great because like companies now have some level of certainty about how they can take those risks, how those risks can be financed, where they can get concessional capital to build out some of these things when the risk is just too high. From a customer perspective, you can say, well, all right, I know that there's going to be green hydrogen now because I didn't know before, but now I know there's going to be green hydrogen. So, I mean, so we're moving in a really positive direction. I mean, are we moving fast enough? No. Are we doing enough? No. But we are moving, and sometimes the fast enough and the enough piece comes after the snowball starts rolling down the hill. And I think we're finally pushing a snowball down.
Yeah, and you see that too. And I think like we were talking about earlier, you need policy, you need dollars from government, but also back to this void, you see venture, right? There's this really interesting chart where you go back, you look in the last 10 years, like, there was about 1.9 billion in 2012 invested in some kind of climate tech. To last year was 40 billion. And so it's great because if you want to really accelerate, I mean, I agree with you 100%. Are we doing things? Yes. Do we need to go way faster? For sure. But I think you need, capital is fuel. And if you can get more talented minds and moving, you will push faster and accelerate those things. So, I am generally an optimist, like I said, I think, but you need everyone engaging in the conversation. And one of the reasons I even started doing interviews like this, because I felt like most people in general were frustrated and they feel like, it's such a hard problem. Like, how do I dissect this thing and talk about it? And you're reading online. I'm like, I need a PhD to decipher what the heck I'm reading here.
That's true. But, the good news is that there's a lot of people who are getting PhDs right now because of this problem and to solve this problem. So that's really helpful. The other thing is like, it's true the venture dollars have gone up and, venture is not known as builders. And ultimately we need builders. But the good thing is that there's also really creative capital approaches on the building side. I mean, I also have a great opportunity to spend some time with a firm called Generate Capital, which is like really created a platform for how you're able to invest in the transition from a project perspective and an infrastructure perspective. So like big money going to hard things with people who really know how to do it. And what the team there has done is just like they